Hey everyone, this is Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at some of the biggest finds in paleontology for November 2023. Let's get started. Starting in Australia, there was the earliest known fossil of a megaraptorid found, coming from the country and from the early Cretaceous. This is actually really interesting for a number of reasons. First off, it's mostly just a frontal bone, which is part of the brain case, and I actually know someone studying a brain case from a megaraptoran from elsewhere in the world. However, that's a megaraptoran, not a megaraptorid. And the megaraptorid part is actually really important here because it's a subgroup of the megaraptorans, of which some of the megaraptorans would lead to the megaraptorids. However, it seems like the megaraptorids were actually pretty limited, at least in where they lived. And by that I mean they mostly seem to have appeared in South America and also Australia. Now, there's probably some across Antarctica. Those places were connected during the early Cretaceous, but we just don't have a lot of fossils there because they're all on ice. Still, this fossil being so early really helps to illuminate how they might have started to evolve, and hopefully we'll get some better materials so we can really understand what it was doing and how it was evolving, so we can understand how the megaraptorids became so successful during the late Cretaceous in the southern continents. Speaking of fossils in Australia, there were also some fossils that ended up getting turned into opals, and that includes things like Eric the plesiosaur, where, it's literally opal. You could wear it as a necklace if it wasn't for the scientific value that the fossil actually held. This paper just looked at the taphonomy of it and how this process of opalization actually happened. And first you need to understand there was a shallow seaway throughout Australia during the Cretaceous, such as being able to find a plesiosaur there. I mean, it would have been swimming in that ocean. However, it died, got buried, and it seems like during the Eocene, when there were a lot of different changes to the geology of Australia, particularly getting drier, it seems like some of the rains that did occur then were able to pick up more minerals and then actually percolate them down and be able to turn some of these fossils into opal by percolating out quartz with some of that water still attached to it chemically. Staying in the southern hemisphere and jumping to New Zealand, there were also bird tracks found coming from a moa, which would have been a giant group of birds that lived in New Zealand up until very recently. And it's really interesting to actually find this because what we actually are starting to understand is they diversified pretty quickly. These fossils are about 3 million years old, at least most likely, and that would make them the second oldest evidence of a moa found anywhere on the islands. It really suggests that once they actually arrived in New Zealand, they diversified pretty rapidly because there's two different trackways. There's one trackway that's leading in one direction made by a smaller animal. There's also another track made by an animal that probably weighed around 158 kilograms, so over 350 pounds. This was probably made by Dinornis, which would have been a much larger moa. It helps to show that they really did diversify pretty quickly. And it's really important for understanding that, based on genetics, they probably actually diverged about 5 million years ago, which is probably around when they got to the island. And we can see that here they had already adopted by about 5 million years to just 3 million years, so over 2 million years, much different lifestyles, or at least different body sizes, with some being very, very large and some being a bit smaller. Jumping back to Australia and in the Cretaceous again, there was also a look at some bird prints from there, and they're actually the oldest evidence of birds found anywhere in Australia. These are also Cretaceous, and they would have been right around the time that birds were really starting to diversify and spread. So this is really good evidence for certain behaviors because there's a lot of tracks in very close proximity to each other, potentially meaning these animals were flocking the way modern birds do. There's a number of different layers that these tracks do show up in, which might actually suggest that they were already migrating. Essentially, they were coming in at certain times of the year when it would have been wetter and they would have been able to leave these tracks in the mud, but then migrated elsewhere when it would have been slightly less wet and there still would have been at least some mud around, but just not as much. Regardless, their presence throughout many different layers in the Phylogeny Formation really helps to show that once birds got to Australia, they were there to stay, and they still have a lot of birds today. Staying with birds and jumping this time to the northern hemisphere in South Korea, there were also prints found from there, except these are very large bird prints. In fact, they line up pretty well with some medium-sized theropod prints. This potentially means that some birds were actually living pretty dinosaur and non-bird-like lives, just foraging along the floor of the forest or wherever they were living, and not necessarily going after much larger prey the way some dromaeosaurs or other medium-sized theropods might, but at least living similarly on the ground as opposed to flitting through trees the way many modern birds do. And staying with almost birds, there are some bird-like tracks coming from the late Triassic of Lesotho, which is really interesting. This would have been millions of years before the birds actually evolved. And they're bird-like, not necessarily birds, because birds, again, probably weren't around at this time. but it does suggest that at least some theropod dinosaurs were taking very bird-like approaches to their locomotion, and potentially it is good evidence for the start of some of the kinds of coelurosaurs that would eventually evolve into the birds. Additionally, it might just be young of some other group of theropods that just happen to have more bird-like feet. It's really hard to know for sure without more fossils, and hopefully we'll get some more in the future that actually have body fossils. Staying in the Triassic, it's easy to forget that the first 30 million years or so of dinosaur evolution did take place in the Triassic, and they weren't the dominant animals in basically any environment. One exception of that is potentially the Herrerasaurs, which were moderately large theropods, or at least theropod relatives. Now there's a new fossil of one coming from the Triassic of Brazil, and it's just part of the pelvis, so there's not exactly a ton of detailed information about it. However, it really does help to suggest that the Herrerasaurs did evolve in South America, and some of these migrated northwards, such as Tawa and Nihoroa. It did have a little projection just in front of the acetabulum, the hole where the femur would attach. This is also similar to some other saurischian dinosaurs that are actually closer to the sauropods, like Buriolestes and Eoraptor. Later theropods, though, like Coelophysis and Dilophosaurus, don't have that kind of projection, meaning it's helping to add to some of the evidence that the Herrerasaurs may have been kind of their own branch of dinosaur evolution, and potentially closer to the sauropods than other theropods were. This also potentially means that when we're looking at how some of the first dinosaur ecosystems started to evolve, we might actually be able to look at the Herrerasaurians and start to understand some of that evolution. Because potentially if they're their own branch, they might be the earliest branch and our best look into early dinosaurs and how they might have behaved. One of the more dominant groups throughout the Triassic was actually the pseudoscorpions, including the Aegilosaurs, which were basically herbivorous land crocs, but before true crocodilians actually evolved. And one of those is Typothorax, which was generally assumed to be about 3 to 4 meters long, or maybe up to 12 feet. This isn't particularly huge, there's some that are known that are a little bit bigger. However, a new fossil coming from petrified forest really does show that actually they could get a lot bigger. And that's because this new fossil, while not as complete as some other ones, does have very similar traits to other Typothorax, meaning we could say, yes, this is also Typothorax, but it's also much, much larger, meaning potentially it could be over 5 meters in length. This would make Typothorax the largest published Aegilosaur. And I say published because the authors are careful to say it is the largest reported Aegilosaur. They may know of other material that does suggest that they could also be similar sizes or even larger, but that's just not published yet. So we're going to have to wait on the final word for how large they could get. But for now, Typothorax is the largest Aegilosaur known. Another group of herbivores in the Triassic were the dicynodonts, and this includes things like Placerius, which was also in the Chinle Formation, the same formation where Typothorax came from. However, now there's a new one that's slightly older, and that's Argodicynodon boreni. And it would have been pretty closely related to Placerius, meaning there was at least one large lineage of dicynodonts in North America throughout most of the Triassic. They probably didn't get to large sizes until after the recovery from the Permian-Triassic extinction, but once they did get large, they were pretty large for a good long time. It also helps us understand some of their behavior potentially being herding. This is even shown in Walking with Dinosaurs with Placerius, where they were all found in one quarry with a whole bunch of individuals. So it made sense to say, yeah, they were all grouped together at least some of the time. I bring this up because Argodicynodon was found in a similar condition. It was a bunch of individuals from basically one bone bed, meaning potentially this is a very common trait among these dicynodonts where they were herding very early on and even at very large sizes. Some large animals, like the dicynodonts, may have actually picked up hitchhikers while walking around, and one of those would actually be the pseudoscorpions, or fake scorpions. And we don't have direct evidence of them in the Triassic, however there is 2 new species coming from the Eocene, which would have probably lived on birds. They're that small they would have been able to latch onto bird feathers and get flown around to wherever they needed to go, and been able to spread across many different environments in that way. The 2 new species are Baltamblyolpium gizmodum and Baltamblyolpium grabenhorsti. And they're preserved in Baltic amber, meaning you can see pretty simply that, yeah, they're pseudoscorpions. But also really importantly, they basically live only in warm places today. And this does include some parts of southern Europe, but they really don't get into northern Europe like these ones were. This suggests that, yeah, there was a pretty significant range decrease in some of these species of pseudoscorpions and likely their hosts as well. This would have been because these were older, these were during the Eocene, and as the temperature started to actually cool down, that meant there was a massive range restriction as the continents started to actually get covered by glaciers during the ice ages, and that prevented many organisms from being able to move northwards. As for some of the animals that the pseudoscorpions could have attached themselves to that were migrating between continents during the Eocene and Oligocene, you actually have some of the first primates. One of the least known of these is Ekgmowechashala from the western part of the United States. It's really unique because it doesn't really line up as far as its tooth shape with many of the other primates that would have been in North America at this time. However, there's a new fossil coming not from North America, but actually part of China that helps to suggest that this was an Asian lineage of primates that actually migrated back into North America. And I say migrated back because many of the earlier primates that we do know are from North America, meaning they probably got their start there. Palaeohodites is the new genus of primate coming from China. It really does help to suggest that Ekgmowechashala actually did come from Asia and migrated back across the Bering Land Bridge and was able to be more successful in regions that the other primates weren't. And that's because many of the other primates were mostly in central North America. Meanwhile, Ekgmowechashala mostly seems to have come from western North America, meaning there was empty ecospace there that it could take advantage of, and seemingly it did. One group of intelligent mammals also evolving around this time would have been the cetaceans, or whales, and one group of them was actually pretty dolphin-like, the Xenorophus. Xenorophus sloanii was the first one of these to be described, and a new look at first the holotype, but also many other fossils of it that have been found, have been able to show that it was a juvenile, or at least the holotype is. This means it would have actually been one of the larger of the Xenorophans, and by that I mean it would have been about 3 meters in length, so about 9 feet long, around the size of a spinner dolphin today. All of the fossils of the Xenorophans actually do come from the Carolinas and Virginia, meaning seemingly this group of fairly diverse dolphin-like animals was pretty localized to just that part of the eastern US. However, it's also really important to understand that they were diverse. In fact, a new species of Xenorophus, Xenorophus simplicidens, was also described in this paper because they found so many fossils from different animals that were in this group, again, all from the Carolinas or Virginia. So this is really interesting for understanding how cetacean diversity actually developed throughout the Oligocene and potentially even into the modern day where we have some of the largest animals to have ever lived. Sticking with whales and even dolphins, but this time true dolphins, there's one that was found that had procumbent teeth, meaning they stuck out of the jaw. Nihoroa reimaea is the new fossil, and it comes from New Zealand. It also, like I said, had teeth that stuck out of the jaws. This has been suggested to have been a feeding strategy, more like things like the sawfish, where essentially it would swing its head back and forth, dismember fish using those teeth that were pointed out, and then be able to more casually catch the pieces of the fish that were killed by the swinging teeth. Unfortunately, though, there hasn't been a ton of biomechanics studies to see how good it would have been at doing this, and I expect there will be some in the future, hopefully there will be at least, because it would be a really interesting idea to see that happening in a mammal, even one that is very adapted to the water. As for other strange mammals, we actually have a paper on tapirs, which tapir are weird. I mean, look at their weird little trunks. But also their scapula can be very, very interesting, because sometimes they have a ridge on the back of their scapula that can hold extra muscle, but also it's just very, very dramatically pushed out of the bone. Tapir have a lot of living relatives, like horses and javelina and pigs. However, none of those animals has the same kind of trait. So these researchers looked at both modern tapir, but also some fossil ones to try and understand how and when this trait actually developed. What the researchers found is that the Malayan tapir, the only tapir not living in the Americas, actually does have a similar ridge. However, it's not quite as pronounced, and it's in a slightly different place running along the spine of the scapula. What this means is that the Malayan tapir probably split earlier from all of the rest of them, and then later on down their lineage, they started to develop this trait in order to move around the environment in different ways. And it's hard to say exactly why they have this trait and many other animals don't. However, it is really good for understanding that tapir are weird, and it does make sense that they would have some unique traits that helps to distinguish them from the other animals that they're related to so that they can take care of different niches. One of the relatives of the tapir would have been the rhinos, and that includes the woolly rhino, which has had DNA sequenced from some parts of the Siberian tundra. However, there really hasn't been DNA studies done in some parts of Europe. Now, though, that's different, because they found fossilized poop. Specifically fossilized poop from hyenas that contained rhino DNA inside of it. And from that they were able to help to look at what kind of DNA made European rhinos different from some of those in the rest of Eurasia. And what they found is it seems like they were two totally different populations. And unfortunately the DNA isn't super complete. It was kind of just left in a cave, so it wasn't necessarily nicely frozen the way some of the animals in the tundra actually have been. This may suggest that these two populations weren't really connected and weren't having a lot of genetic exchange the way you would expect were a complete population. And potentially that just as they moved northwards, they evolved in very similar ways, but still developed separately. As for other animals that can handle the cold, there's the one living rhynchocephalian that's still around, and that's in New Zealand, the tuatara, which operates at a much lower temperature than most other reptiles. However, they were pretty diverse early on, and a new fossil helps to show how they may have gotten their start, or at least where they might have. Wirtembergia hauboldae is a new fossil rhynchocephalian coming from Germany, and while it's not super complete, there is enough material from a couple of different individuals to be able to understand that, yeah, would have been a rhynchocephalian. It also comes from the middle of the Triassic, so a bit earlier than most other fossils of rhynchocephalians, meaning this is the first one known, or at least the earliest occurrence, of a rhynchocephalian. Importantly, the rhynchocephalians are very closely related to the squamates, or modern lizards and snakes. This probably means that there should also be at least some lizard fossils also floating around in the middle Triassic. It's just a matter of actually getting out there and finding them. Staying with lizards, but this time the ocean-going giants, the mosasaurs, there was the first study looking at micro-wear patterns on their teeth. Whenever an animal bites something, the teeth do get worn down at least a little bit. And so that's what this paper tried to do, is look at how the wear patterns suggest different things about the diets of different mosasaurs. And what they found is there's actually a lot of overlap. This is interesting because things like globidens, for example, had very rounded teeth, and it's been suggested, it must have been a specialist, eating mostly mollusks, and potentially even some cephalopods, things like ammonites. However, because of the study, we can say, yeah, sure, it could have very well done that, but it also would have eaten anything else that it could have gotten its jaws on. It's not like they were that specialized just for eating hard things. And still in the water with reptiles, we're actually looking at some crocodilomorphs, meaning they're not quite crocodilians, but they're not crocodilians. And some of them did become fully aquatic and marine. They would have lived basically their entire lives in the water. This paper, though, tried to see if they could actually understand how they did that by looking at many different specimens. And what they found is actually many of those different groups did not go about it the same way at all. They had much different musculature in these different groups for getting around in the water. And this helps us suggest that there's not some kind of one-size-fits-all method for crocodilians that are migrating into the water and becoming more and more aquatic as opposed to more semi-aquatic the way many modern ones are. And moving to land-based archosaurs, we're going to be looking at a dinosaur, Allosaurus, which would have been an abelisaur with really, really small arms. This paper looked at the axial skeleton of the Allosaurus, meaning they were basically looking at the hips and the vertebra. On the vertebra, they noticed some very small holes called foramina that would have actually been next to the neural spines. These probably helped to support an air sac system, making the animal lighter, but also potentially helping support the vertebra in some way for when it was running. It also had some traits like one of the ridges on the side spines on the vertebra, especially the tail vertebra, that are very similar to things like Viavenator and Carnotaurus, two of the more derived late occurring abelisaurs. This suggests that at least this very small subgroup of the abelisaurs had really, really unique morphology, and it was likely attached to their lifestyles of being very, very fast predators, at least by dinosaur standards. As you start getting up to certain weights, it's harder and harder to run just because of the mass of the animal. There was also a new dinosaurus, Ekgmowechashala yanui, an allosaur coming from Mongolia. It was actually found in what appears to be a sleeping position, and at least in some ways it does resemble that of birds, despite not being that closely related to birds. It is still more closely related than some other theropods, but still not directly related to them. This behavior of tucking the head under what would have been a wing has been suggested to have occurred fairly early, especially since we do have some troodontids that were also found preserved in similar poses. It's also really unfortunate for this Ekgmowechashala because it was probably sleeping nicely, and then suddenly a sand dune collapsed on top of it and buried it alive, which, again, unfortunate for it, but a wonderful fossil to have, and really helps to fill in some gaps of just what we don't know about certain groups of dinosaur evolution, specifically the alvarezsaurs, because they also have these really weird arms with one major claw on them, at least in some of the later ones. And as we continue to find more fossils of them, we can come to a better understanding of what exactly their role was in the environment. There's also the first sauropod bone coming from Cambodia, and Southeast Asia has been growing in its paleontological discoveries as more geologic study has been done there. The fossil isn't that complete, it's just a single fibula, but it is enough to say it would have been a large Brachiosaurus-like sauropod. Staying in Eastern Asia but moving north into China, there's also a new fossil pterosaur coming from the J-hole biota. Cratonopterus hauboldae is the new taxa, and it's not as complete as some other really wonderful fossils from the J-hole biota, but it was also preserved in 3D. That means we can do some other tests with it, such as being able to, first of all, find out that it's a Ctenochasmid, a group of mostly filter-feeding pterosaurs, but also that we can look at the thickness of its bones. And it was found to actually have relatively thick finger bones that would have been used to support its wing. This is really interesting because, in general, the thick finger bones were thought to only really be present in the Sungipterids, a specific group of the pterosaurs. This discovery of thick bone walls in a different group of pterosaurs means potentially ancestrally they all had thick bones, and just many of them secondarily lost that trait and developed thinner bones. So, really interesting look at how these different pterosaurs may have actually evolved, just coming from one simple fossil, and it's not even the best fossil from the J-hole biota. Wapitisaurus problematicus was so described because it is a problem. It was first suggested to have been a Wegeltosaurid, a very late Wegeltosaurid, and that means it probably would have glided between trees. The Wegeltosaurids were very interesting animals. I should do a whole separate video on them. The question for Wapitisaurus, though, is was it actually a Wegeltosaurid or was it something different? And from this research, these people were able to go, yeah, it's not a Wegeltosaurid, it probably didn't glide, instead it probably swam. Instead, it seems like it was much more closely related to the thalattosaurs. And they were very interesting animals in their own right, I should also do a video on them, but it helps to suggest that this isn't necessarily some very late occurring Wegeltosaurid. This kind of finding actually makes a lot of sense because it also would have been the only Wegeltosaurid in the Triassic, and also would have been almost an entire planet away from where the other ones have been found. It also helps to explain why there's not just some sort of 50 million year old ghost lineage that we're finding here, because most of the other Wegeltosaurids were basically around during the Permian, and not so much in the Triassic. In fact, it would have been the only occurrence of one in the Triassic. So this makes a lot of sense, it's really interesting to see, and the thalattosaurs are very interesting in their own right. Staying with things that were evolving in the water, we actually have us. And not necessarily recently, but far, far back with the first tetrapods. And one of the big questions has been, how did this part develop? Essentially, how did pectoral girdles actually evolve? Because in most fish, there's not bones there to turn into some sort of structure to actually support the body weight. What it seems like happened based on a number of different fossils is some of the pharyngeal gill slits, essentially the rearmost gill arches, actually migrated down in the body and were able to develop the muscle attachments to be able to move the limbs independently. And from there, they were able to eventually turn that into walking on land. Staying with movement, last month I described a paper that looked at two new pleurocystid echinoderms, which are really odd echinoderms that would have been related to things like sea stars and crinoids. And now there's a new paper looking at how these animals might have moved. And they did that by making a soft-bodied robot. And from that they were able to say, hey yeah, it was pretty dang slow, at least by their tests. However, it would have been pretty similar to the same movement speed as some modern-day crinoids when they're kind of crawling along the sea floor. So it's not entirely impossible that this was still a very useful trait for them to have, and potentially even get around with. Unfortunately, they're extinct though now, so we can't really say that much, and this is a really cool study to be able to use new technologies to actually be able to understand how some of these organisms might have lived. With some other odd fossils that would have also been related to echinoderms, but not echinoderms, we have Ezekiel's wheel, which was so named because it looked like one of the Ezekiel's wheels, or at least the description of one from the Bible. The fossil has now been named Rhodocirca superbus, and it's gotten a proper description where now we can say, hey, we think we know what this is, and it was probably a pterobrink. The pterobrinks have been really useful historically with the graptolites, with them being able to be defined by very certain time bands. Essentially, they would only be around for a little bit, but everywhere, so if you find those fossils, you know how old the rocks are. Rhodocirca, though, wouldn't have been quite like that, floating around in the ocean. Instead, it would have been pseudo-colonial, at least hanging together in an almost colonial-like fashion, and living mostly on the sea floor. It's still really interesting for understanding their broader evolution, though, because it belongs to a group that was thought to have been the earliest branching of the pterobrinks, meaning hopefully now we can start getting a better picture of their early evolution. Modern-day pterobrinks reproduce by just sending larvae into the ocean to float around as plankton, and it's been hard to know exactly when that occurred and when that trait actually evolved. However, a new fossil of Herptogaster really helps to suggest that this was a trait early on in things like the pterobrinks and also their other relatives like the acorn worms. And this is because this fossil of Herptogaster appears to actually have some of these larvae also preserved in the rock. Phylogenetically, Herptogastra is also found to be really close to the base of the Ambulocranians, which would include the pterobranchs and the acorn worms, meaning that potentially, again, this is very ancestral to both of those groups. Staying in the Cambrian, you gotta remember the Cambrian explosion, where a lot of different organisms in different groups started to radiate. And what these researchers were able to find is good evidence for rapid growth in one of their large predators during the Cambrian. And Plectobelua comes from the Qianyang biota, which is kind of like the Burgess Shale, only it's in China and contains very similar groups. By looking at 432 specimens of Amplupolecta, there's a lot of them coming from this formation, they were able to show that it would have grown relatively quickly, and that was probably an adaptation to be able to hunt more things. The Cambrian was really the first time that large-scale food webs were actually starting to develop in ecosystems after all, and fast growth may have just been one strategy that really led to the early success of things like Anomalocaris as well, as these would have both been radiodonts and mostly top predators in their environments. And finally, before I get into papers that I did entire videos on, there is an entire book looking at reptile evolution, and they call them sauropsids here. I just choose reptiles because they're basically the same groups anyway. However, there were some new species described, such as Gremlin slobodorum, which would have been a leptoceratopsian, so not a very large ceratopsian, but there were a number of these around, such as Pherisaurus, which was described just a few years ago. There's a number of different scientific papers in this, and some of the other topics that they hit on are things like tyrannosaur footprints and mosasaur gut contents, as well as one paper that's actually just looking at theropod hands and how they would have functioned. It covers a lot of ground and it's pretty interesting. And now for the papers I've done separate videos on, there was one looking at the brain case of Thescelosaurus, which would have been pretty interesting because it seems like it had a lot of adaptations for being able to burrow, and the brain is just part of those adaptations. There are also two new species of Spherotholus, a type of pachycephalosaur described, and it's really interesting because it helps to show that there's probably a lot of diversity in smaller animals that were just missing in the fossil record due to either collection biases or preservation biases. The smaller animals probably don't get fossilized quite as well, but at least here where we have some of those, it seems like they were pretty diverse. There was also a paper that looked at the chemistry of teeth in different animals that would have lived in the Cretaceous and were able to say, hey, Troodontids were probably pretty herbivorous. Not necessarily totally herbivorous, but at least eating plants some of the time, which is in line with some of the ideas that they were potentially at least omnivorous. There was also a paper that looked at some of the claims that Displetosaurus wilsoni shows that the Tyrannosaurines evolved directly out of the genus Displetosaurus. This has been up for contention since the Displetosaurus wilsoni paper came out last year, and now there's starting to be some papers responding to it. There's still people working on Displetosaurus wilsoni though, so we'll see what the future holds for our understanding of Tyrannosaur taxonomy. And finally, there's a look at bite marks in the Morrison Formation, and they do a ton of work here. They look at a ton of fossils and we're able to say, hey yeah, some of these were nibbled on by theropod dinosaurs. Now this paper isn't necessarily doing a ton of important statistical research on it, but it is at least presenting the information of which bites are actually present on which fossils. This means that in the future, hopefully people will be able to work on Morrison Formation bite marks even more. And it's really hard to work on things if you don't know they're there. So while this paper doesn't have immediate rewarding scientific information of, hey yeah, look, we proved that this was eating this or whatever, it is really important for being able to do that work in the future. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Really appreciate the support we've been getting. You're all wonderful people, unless you're not, but I assume most of you are. You all generally seem pretty wonderful. Happy holidays. My feet hurt. You know, be safe. Take care. Don't go extinct. Drive safe in the holidays. Yeah, people are idiots. Bye.